Good morning and welcome to the Public Service Commission of South Carolina. It is Tuesday, March 19th at 10 a.m. and we are here for an allowable ex parte communication briefing. Let's take a roll call of commissioners present in the hearing room. We have Vice Chair Powers, Commissioner Thomas, Commissioner Carolee Williams, Commissioner Caston, and Chair Belser. I note for the record that Commissioner Justin Williams is on sick leave today. Let me recognize our staff counsel, Ms. Mosier, to read the, I say the docket, but it's a non-docketed matter, but to read the matter.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, commissioners, and to all who are present here today. As stated, today is Tuesday, March 19th, 2024, and we are here in the Commission's hearing room pursuant to a notice of request for an allowable ex parte briefing from the Southeastern Wind Coalition in non-docket 2024-12-E. The subject matter, notice to be discussed today is regarding offshore wind's potential to meet economic development, grid reliability, and resource demand needs in the Southeast. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Mosier. Let's take appearances. Good morning, Mr. Adams.
Yes, ma'am. Weston Adams, Nelson Mullins Law Firm here in Columbia for the Southeastern Wind Coalition.
Thank you, Mr. Adams. And who is here for the Office of Regulatory Staff?
Good morning, Madam Chair. My name is Chris Huber, and I'm here as the designee of the Acting Executive Director of the Office of Regulatory Staff.
Thank you, Mr. Huber, and welcome. Before we begin, we're going to set out the ground rules. As you know, we are limited to how these matters proceed, and so I'm going to ask everyone's patience and recognize Ms. Mosier again.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This, I would remind everyone, is a briefing and not a hearing. The briefing must be conducted in compliance with the provisions of South Carolina Code Section 58-3-260C, and the requirements of that statute are, in part, that the allowable ex parte briefing be confined to the subject matter that has been noticed. I would therefore ask the presenters, commissioners, and staff to please refrain from discussing any matters that are not related to the specific topics. The statute prohibits any presenter, commissioners, or commission staff from requesting or giving any commitment, predetermination, or prediction regarding any action by any commissioner as to an ultimate or penultimate issue, which is either is or is likely to come before the commission. I would also ask the presenters, staff, and commissioners to refrain from referencing any report, article, statute, or document of any kind that has not been included in today's presentation. A copy of any document which is referenced during the briefing must be provided to the Office of Regulatory Staff for inclusion into the record, which will be certified to the Chief Clerk of the Commission, Ms. Jocelyn Boyd. If anyone during the course of this briefing exceeds the scope or does not comply with or fails to conduct themselves within the provisions of South Carolina Code Section 58-3-260, governing allowable ex parte briefings, it is expected that a contemporaneous objection will be made. Finally, everyone in attendance today must sign in or register. Everyone in the hearing room must read, sign, and return the form which you were given at the door, which will include instructions and the deadline for its return. It is required by law for each attendee to certify that the requirements contained in Section 58-3-260C have been complied with in this presentation. Thank you all for your time and attention. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Mosier. Mr. Huber, do you have any additional instructions or ground rules for us?
Nothing further, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Huber. Mr. Adams, you're an old hand at this, and
Yes,
I'm
ma'am.
going to turn it over to you now.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you for being here today.
Yes, ma'am. We're excited to be here today with our client, the Southeastern Wind Coalition. I've got two folks from the coalition with me. On my far right is Carly Lohan. She resides in Jacksonville, North Carolina. She's the North Carolina Program Manager and the Outreach Manager for the Southeastern Wind Coalition. She has a history of working for environmental groups prior to joining the Southeastern Wind Coalition. To my immediate right is Catherine Collins, who's the president of the Southeastern Wind Coalition. She's out of Chapel Hill, North Carolina. She has an MBA from Duke and a master's in environmental science from Duke. She previously worked for Boston-based developer First Wind. She also worked for the Wind Alliance and for RTI International. I'm going to turn the wheel over to Catherine Collins and let her tell you about their group and the work that they do. Catherine?
Thank you, Weston. I appreciate it. Good morning, commissioners. We really appreciate the opportunity to be speaking with you all today. And like Weston said, we're very excited. Carly and I love nothing more than talking about wind, so apologies in advance. Hopefully we can, we'll try to keep things as brief as possible and look forward to any questions that you all may have. So with that, I will go ahead and get started and talk a little bit about the Southeastern Wind Coalition. As Weston said, I am based in North Carolina. The Southeastern Wind Coalition is a 501c3 nonprofit. We work to advance wind energy in the Southeast in ways that benefit residents, ratepayers, utilities, and the industry. So our organization actually covers 11 states in the Southeast. Our efforts are targeted toward state and local governments, regulators, utilities, and the general public. So like I said, we love talking about wind. It's what we get to do all day, every day. Our organization is, we are a membership organization. So we do have developers, utilities, and some of the ancillary companies that, that provide services and products to the wind industry as members of the coalition. But I think it's also really important to note that the vast majority of our funding, over 80%, is philanthropic funding. What this means is that we are not a trade organization. We are really looking out for the industry as a whole and are able to talk about things from that perspective. I'll also mention here the coalition takes an objective, data-driven, and economic development-focused approach to ensure that the Southeast can take advantage of this clean, cost-efficient generation source. Oh, I have the clicker. Here we go. Maybe. There we go. So let me start just by talking a little bit about the history and evolution of offshore wind. I think it's really interesting to note that this is an industry that's been around for over 30 years. The first turbine was a pilot project off the coast of Denmark and the UK, built in 1991. And then a few years later in 1998, the first commercial scale development was constructed, again, Denmark and the UK. And we fast forward to 2024, over 64 gigawatts of offshore wind is deployed worldwide. The vast majority of that is in Europe and Asia. Those are also the areas where we've seen a lot of the manufacturing take hold for wind. You can also see here there's been a significant evolution in the technology from the early days of 1991 when turbines were far less than 1 megawatt to now the state-of-the-art turbines being installed are 14 to 15 megawatts each. Those larger turbines mean that we can build greater capacity wind farms with smaller footprints. The efficiencies are not only applied to size, but also to the ability of those turbines to capture energy at lower wind speeds. So you can, again, just get more energy out of the same machine. Talked a little bit about the global impact of offshore wind. In the U.S. here, you can see the U.S. offshore wind project pipeline is significant. We've got a pipeline of about 52 gigawatts as of 2023. Within that 52 gigawatt pipeline, there are actually 3 operating projects. The first operating project is the Block Island project. That's 5 turbines, actually built in state waters off the coast of Rhode Island, which is a little bit interesting. And the second project was the CVOW, which is short for the Virginia Offshore Wind coastal Virginia offshore wind project. That is 2 turbines, 12 megawatts, 27 miles off the coast of Virginia Beach. And last, certainly not least, we have listed here when we did this PowerPoint a couple weeks ago, there were 2 projects under construction. One of those actually completed construction last week. So the Vineyard Wind 1 project is still under construction. That's 800 megawatts, a very large project. But South Fork Wind they wrapped up construction last week and are now supplying power to the state of New York. That project is 132 megawatts. So a lot of exciting times in this industry. You know, certainly the early stages for the U.S., but not the early stages in terms of the worldwide opportunities for offshore wind. And then you can see at the bottom 37 projects in the development pipeline for a total of 45 gigawatts.
May I ask what the black numbers are that seem to be sequential but don't start with 1 or that it's got
The black numbers, those just reference the individual lease areas.
Oh, okay, thank you.
So all of that development pipeline translates into tens of billions of dollars of investment opportunity. So I mentioned, you know, with the vast majority of the projects being in Europe and Asia, the components and the machines that make up a wind farm are incredibly large. What that means is that most of the final construction and assembly of those components is done in on the water in ports. There is a significant opportunity for more inland areas. You can see here in the map on the right just kind of shows job opportunities across the country once we make it to a 4 to 5 gigawatt annual pipeline of projects, and that same pipeline represents an investment of $22 billion in ports, installation vessels, manufacturing facilities. In 2023 alone, we saw, 2022 alone, we saw a $2.7 billion investment in those same areas.
Chair Belser,
Commissioner Williams?
I have a clarifying question. I
Please.
may have heard you wrong, but I thought I heard 4 to 5 gigawatts. But what I see looks like 4 to 6.
Yes, thank you. The
Just
4 to
clarify.
6 gigawatts. Yeah, the 4 to 6 gigawatts is that's a number that the OEMs or the original equipment manufacturers of these turbines have said, we need to see this kind of annual pipeline in order to fully invest in that U.S. manufacturing system. So looking at everything from the nacelles to the blades to the towers and ensuring that all of that is manufactured, constructed in the U.S. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about some of the investments with the IRA. But there is an incredible opportunity for those components to all be constructed in the U.S.
4 to 5 is what's in the pipeline now.
No, that is, so what is currently in the pipeline is, here, let me
Right.
jump back a slide.
Well, just clarify what 4 to 5 was. When I heard you say that, my brain kind of.
That's okay. 4 to 5 gigawatts is the annual amount of construction that the OEMs would like to see in order to fully commit to a U.S. based supply chain. Apologies.
And 4 to 6 is?
4 to 6. I'm calling it 4 to 5, but yes, 4 to 6.
Okay, got it. Okay.
Yeah, so the 4 to 6 gigawatts is just those OEMs saying, if we've got a pipeline, if the developers can commit to building 4 to 6, sorry, I keep using 4 to 5, 4 to 6
Okay.
gigawatts.
Now we both understand our confusion, but thank
We're
you for
good
the
to go.
clarification.
Yes. But the actual U.S. pipeline right now is 45. That's where I must, is 45 gigawatts. All right. So just to give you a sense of the scale and what that looks like here, we've got two illustrations. The first is monopiles coming in for the Seabow commercial project. That's a 2,600 megawatt project that is being built contiguous with the current pilot project off the coast of Virginia. Construction on that project will start in May of this year. But here you can see the monopiles being barged in, and those monopiles are the pieces that are partially submerged, fully submerged underwater, but also partially submerged in the seabed. So pretty, again, the scale of these things is hard to understand until you see them in person. But they are, it's an incredible sight. The second visual is the Vineyard Wind staging. So the Vineyard Wind project off the coast of Massachusetts, this is the New Bedford Marine Terminal. This terminal was an underutilized port. New Bedford was actually known for whaling. If anybody's been there, they have a very interesting whaling museum. But as you can imagine, that's not really an industry that can sustain an economy this day and age. And so what they've done is they've repurposed this port to be a staging facility where they bring the components in. You can see here they call it a laydown yard where all of those components are safely stored until they are ready to be, they can be partially assembled. So you'll see some of the tower sections there being partially assembled, but then they'll put those on a barge, take them out to the project development area, and then they are installed at sea. So a very, again, if you ever have an opportunity to see any of this in person, it's a pretty incredible operation.
I've got a quick question.
Yeah, please.
Are those blades beyond the support?
They are.
Okay.
Yes, those are the blades, again, waiting for installation. And the blades themselves, just seeing those things in person, it's hard to get a sense of the scale here of just how large some of those components are. But again, you'll see they never leave a port. Those blades are large enough that they are constructed in a port facility and moved only by ship. They are far too large to be moved on a train or road. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Carly.
Good morning, Commissioners. My name is Carly Lohan. I work with Catherine at the Southeastern Wind Coalition, and bear with me, I'm dealing with some seasonal allergies, so I've got water here, and I'll do my best. But today, I want to shift gears a little bit. I know Catherine's talked quite a bit about the global and U.S.-based investment for offshore wind, and we often get questions about how project components contribute to the total cost of an offshore wind project. So this graphic is really just a tool to help people understand the CapEx of an offshore wind project and how that fits into the total LCOE. And again, this is not project specific. It really just gives you an idea of how costs are distributed, but I do think it's noteworthy to mention that the turbine components, so the actual, the components that you just saw in the photo Catherine showed, for example, make up about a third of that CapEx. And the electrical infrastructure also makes up a pretty significant portion as well. And then this is from the same report that we have referenced here, but what this graphic shows is how the CapEx actually fits into the total LCOE. So the CapEx, which is what you saw on the previous slide, makes up about 67% of the total LCOE, and the OpEx is the rest of the 33% of that LCOE. And we also recognize that offshore wind is a rapidly evolving and shifting industry in the United States, and the costs are kind of hard to pinpoint. But again, this graphic is a tool, and it gives us a sense of how offshore wind compares to other generation resources. This graphic specifically from the Lazard LCOE 2023 report is only specific to renewables. But we find that the Lazard annual report, it's really helpful for looking at where offshore wind falls compared to other technologies at a given time. And the other benefit of showing this graphic is that we like to point out that offshore wind has a huge opportunity to take advantage of tax credits, specifically those the ITC guidelines that were reissued under the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. So the investment tax credit through the IRA is currently 30% through 2032. And we say that based on language in the Treasury guidance. But the 30% assumes that projects meet apprenticeship and prevailing wage requirements, which U.S. projects will in fact do. And then there's an additional 20% of add-on credits for investments in energy communities and domestic supply chain and things like that. And so that adds up to a total of a 50% tax credit for a multi-billion-dollar project. That's a huge cost that is offset by these tax credits. And as Catherine mentioned a few slides ago, offshore wind manufacturers need that 4 to 6 gigawatt project pipeline per year to kind of commit and make that investment into domestic manufacturing. And this tax credit can be a tool in kind of helping those early gigawatts get there and get that industry started and ensure that domestic manufacturing is something that's available to the industry for years to come. The take-home message here is that projects with a construction or operation date before 2032 have the highest likelihood of taking advantage of this tax credit, again, based on the language that's outlined in the IRA Treasury guidance. And we'll talk a little bit more in a few slides about how this tax credit can specifically, this tax credit and this economic opportunity applies to South Carolina. But again, the take-home message is that this tax credit investment is so significant, and it's going to be really critical for those projects that are going to meet the development milestone or the construction milestone before 2032.
May I ask a question?
Absolutely.
On that? What's the timeline from conception to completion of construction or bringing online? What's a typical timeline?
It's kind of hard to say. It does vary. I think as the project pipeline matures a little bit, that becomes a more efficient process. But when we look at the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, which is the federal entity that handles offshore wind leasing and permitting, it's about a 7 to 10 year process, depending on the project and all of the permits and compliance that's involved in that process.
Okay, that's permitting and construction to 7 to 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, absolutely. And I can always go back to the project pipeline map if it's helpful. But this map shows projects that are already in that pipeline.
Right.
So they've already started along that 7 to 10 year process, if that's helpful.
Yes, thank you.
Madam Chair.
Commissioner Thomas?
Thank you. So back on slide number 9, it mentions designated energy communities. What is a designated energy community?
To be frank, I would have to reference the IRA Treasury guidance, which is linked in this PowerPoint. It's a component of the Inflation Reduction Act that is still very much the process of interpretation and defining an energy community is still in progress. I know there's been some progress on defining energy communities, but I don't know that there's like a final a final definition of energy communities. Does that sound correct?
Yeah, it has primarily to do with what percentage of an economy was built on historical energy usage or manufacturing generation. So a lot of coal communities, areas where there was previously a natural gas plant that is being decommissioned. So a lot of those areas where you had jobs that were based on energy, that maybe those jobs might be transitioning. And so the idea with the energy communities is that you are reinvesting in those communities that are transitioning from one energy resource source to another. There's also a component that is that has to do with levels of pollution. So I think that's why they call it energy communities and keep it so broad. So areas that have higher levels of pollution then are also have a higher likelihood of that energy community designation. So I think the energy communities themselves have been designated, but as they relate to offshore wind, that's where the Treasury guidance is still being finalized as Treasury tries to decide. Because when you think about an offshore wind farm, you're not building them in a coal community. So inherently. So it's really a matter of what components, if there is a substation there, then does that qualify the project? So, kind of getting into the nitty gritty there.
Okay. And one more question on this slide. I'm having a hard time reading it. And just kind of at a high level, I'm looking at the bottom designation. It's the wind offshore. And I'm trying to understand the meaning of looks like 2 bars down there. Can you just give me a high-level overview of what those stand for? I'm sure it's on here, but I can't read it.
Yes, absolutely. No, it is. It is quite small. So underneath the title for the x-axis of the graph, it shows that the blue bar recognizes the unsubsidized LCOE of the generation resource, and then the light blue, almost gray color is the subsidized, an example of the subsidized LCOE. But I do think it is important to mention that that subsidy excludes the domestic content adder. So it's not the full 50% tax credit that is shown in this graph. And it probably varies from resource to resource what the total tax credit is that's captured there.
And that's just because Lazard, they're actually almost a year out. So Lazard releases their annual report. I think generally in the springtime, and so when this graph was released specifically, they didn't have that same guidance from the IRS that we have now.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Madam Chair, may I follow up on that?
Commissioner Caston?
The bars you defined, the one with the crosshatch, and then you have the solid blue bar, says subsidized, and I assume excluding domestic content, and the crosshatch was subsidized including domestic content.
That's correct.
You probably just explained it and I missed it.
That's totally okay. So that light blue bar, you're correct. The light blue bar shows the subsidy excluding domestic content. Think about the crosshatch section as the crosshatch plus the light blue bar, and then that total section would be the subsidy including domestic content.
Okay, and the domestic content.
The domestic content is that 10% adder, where and one of the reasons I think that Lazard chose to show it this way is that, again, we go back to what is the availability of domestic content right now? That we are just starting to build these monopile factories in the U.S. There's a Nucor Steel is building a specific steel plant in Brandenburg, Kentucky, that is meant to be the U.S. steel provider for those towers. So as this takes hold, some of the questions from developers, or maybe Lazard here, has been, well, we want to meet domestic content requirements. Will that domestic supply chain be ready when we need to build our project?
Thank you, ma'am.
And if it's helpful to kind of frame it in a different way, you can think of that blue section is the 30% tax credit, and then the blue plus the crosshatched is approximately a 40% tax credit. And then there's other adders that can be added as well, but what that differentiation is the domestic content adder specifically.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Any other questions on that one? Okay.
Madam Chair.
Vice Chair Powers?
Thank you. I do have a question. I was probably waiting a little longer. I represent the 7th Congressional District, which goes from the North Carolina line down to the Charleston County line, and of course, every beach that is contained in that area. Tourism, I mean, you talk about economic development. Tourism is the name of the game there.
Absolutely.
And it's, at times I've heard that tourism is in fact, the biggest industry in South Carolina. How are you going to sell those ideas to the coastal type?
Yes, absolutely. So that is actually something that my work specifically at the Southeastern Wind Coalition has spent a lot of time focusing on. With the current project pipeline, there are no projects off the coast of South Carolina right now or in the near-term project development pipeline. So if viewshed is the concern, there's no major immediate conflict off the coast. In terms of the economic development portion of it, the development that Catherine has mentioned and that quayside investment for those large components to be fabricated and constructed and staged on the coast would happen, or at least where we're seeing it happen in the Northeast, is on existing infrastructure. They're not necessarily going and building a new port. They're utilizing that infrastructure that's already there or is already utilized, or it's kind of repurposed in some type of multi-use facility.
Well, how does all that affect South Carolina?
That is a great question. And that is actually exactly what we were going to talk about in the next couple slides. So
okay.
I'm happy to kind of jump into that, and then we can revisit your question if it remains unanswered.
Go ahead.
Wonderful. Thank you. And our vice chairman read my mind. We're going to talk about again, a little bit of the economic development opportunity and how that applies to South Carolina and frame it a little bit more on a local scale. We're also going to spend some time talking about South Carolina's energy demand, and South Carolina has been seeing exponential economic development outside of any type of offshore wind industry. And there's those industries have energy needs, and we're going to talk about, again, how offshore wind could kind of apply there. And then we also want to talk about the reliability, the grid reliability, and consumer benefit aspects of offshore wind as well. So this is just a little bit of a framework of what we're going to talk about on the next few slides. So first and foremost, South Carolina's offshore wind value chain. This is something that we do at the Southeastern Wind Coalition, but these graphics are specifically from the American Jobs Project and their South Carolina specific report. But as Catherine mentioned, there's those what we call tier 1 components of offshore wind turbines. So that's everything you see when you look at a turbine. So the blades, the nacelle, the towers, the monopiles, all those large structures that need to be manufactured quayside at a port. One of my favorite fun facts about offshore wind is that there's over 8,000 components in an offshore wind turbine, and many of those components are made out of steel, and there are many manufacturing companies or manufacturer suppliers that can contribute to that industry. So this map captures that to some degree, but we do also spend quite a time keeping and maintaining a database on the Southeastern Wind Coalition website where we actually track all of the companies in South Carolina that already, and across the Southeast, that already contribute to the land-based wind supply chain, and companies that have, kind of raised their hand and say, we make X component that could contribute to an offshore wind project. So that is kind of one way that a tool that we use to gauge the economic opportunity. But again, as Catherine mentioned, the reason this is so exciting for South Carolina is because that economic development opportunity is not strictly a coastal economic opportunity. There's an opportunity for those jobs to either come to those manufacturing companies that are expanding their business to support the industry, or even attracting and recruiting new businesses to support the industry. And we've already seen some of that in South Carolina, and some key examples here. Prismian Group recently saw a $200 million investment for HV cables for some offshore wind projects in the Northeast. Nexon's South Carolina facility has also seen a similar investment, and Nucor Steel has seen a $425 million investment in Berkeley County operations. That's not specifically for the wind industry, but it is something, again, where they've identified interest and ability to support the offshore wind industry. So there are so many companies that are here, they're home based, they employ South Carolina workers, they create local jobs, the jobs stay here. And that's an opportunity for companies who would like to elect to participate in the industry to do so. Another tool that we're very excited about to help kind of further communicate the economic development opportunity to South Carolina and again, better communicate the opportunity beyond the coast is the offshore wind supply chain study that you may all have heard about. The South Carolina Department of Commerce and Clemson University are partnering to develop this. And they recently, I believe they just closed their RFP process to find a partner to help Clemson with that analysis, the economic analysis portion of that. But the main takeaways from that supply chain analysis will be actionable recommendations for developing or recruiting the business community. And there will also be some market and policy recommendations as well. And we're hoping to see preliminary results sometime in the next few months, but we are looking forward to a final report expected in September of 2024. In terms of South Carolina's economic growth and what that means for the state's energy demand, the South Carolina Department of Commerce put out their 2023 industry recruitment report in early January, and they found that from January to December of 2023, the state announced a total capital investment of $9.22 billion, which is the largest amount in state history. And what's really exciting about that is, South Carolina is showing year-over-year growth and economic development, which is wonderful. It means jobs and financial growth for the state, but at the same time, many of the industries that are coming to South Carolina, such as the EV manufacturing industry or the I've heard people refer to it as the battery belt. Those companies not only have a large demand for energy, but many of those companies also usually have some sort of requirement for renewable energy, and they are going to the states and making investments in the states that can not only meet their energy demands, but can meet those energy demands with some sort of renewable large-scale generation, such as offshore wind. And then I think the other thing that's really important to mention here is that the South Carolina's energy consumption is mainly industrial, but it's split pretty evenly between sectors. So the residential, commercial, industrial, and transportation sector all use a significant amount of South Carolina's energy that they produce. But again, that industry sector, specifically the manufacturing supply chain sector, is one of the fastest growing sectors. And again, one of the sectors that is making investments in places that can meet energy demands in a reliable way, in a least cost way, and can offer a renewable resource as well.
Chair Belser.
Commissioner Carolee Williams.
Thank you. Is it Ms. Lohan?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. You mentioned, and others have mentioned, just in passing, and you may not know the answer to this question, and that's okay, that new industry is coming to South Carolina and that they have a requirement for an amount of renewable energy. Are you aware of anybody who's kind of looked at all of that and said, we've got this much that's committed and this much that in terms of industry and this much renewable energy that is needed to sustain those requirements?
That's a great question. There's a number of resources come to mind, but I can't think of one off the top of my head that maybe answers all of those questions in one.
I'm not trying to bring anything.
No,
new
I was
into
going to say,
this.
please let's not bring in any kind of other document.
Yeah,
references.
That was my goal, was if you knew, because you brought it up.
Yeah,
Thank you very
that's okay.
much.
Yeah, no, I'm not aware of any South Carolina specific resource to answer that question.
Ms. Lohan, I have a question on that pie chart on
Yes,
the
ma'am.
slide 12. The transportation sector.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me what is encompassed by that. Do you know? I know that's an EIA report, but I'm just curious.
It's if
Or
you're
Ms.
asking
Collins?
if it's electricity versus energy, that it's all energy.
Oh,
this
it's all
isn't-
energy.
Yeah,
so
Okay, it's just not electricity.
No.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
No.
I thought the same thing when I first thought. I was like, wow, that would be a lot of EVs.
Well, and I looked at it and I was like, oh yes, but then I wanted to make sure that I wasn't missing something. So thank you. Good question. Okay. All right, moving along.
I'll snag that from you.
Yes, absolutely.
All right, thank you. So Carly talked about a lot of the economic benefits, the supply chain benefits, and started mentioned that we would also talk about why offshore wind is an important electricity resource for South Carolina. And so that's what I will touch on with this slide here. So I've got a couple of points. The first is that offshore wind is a highly reliable energy source. Offshore wind generation profiles obviously do vary, but they fluctuate much less than a number of other intermittent resources, and they are extremely predictable. We think about how far the industry of weather prediction has come, and with all of the data analytics combined with that industry of predicting weather has become more and more important as more of our energy resources are weather dependent in some way, shape, or form. The other fantastic thing about offshore wind is that it is nearly always generating some electricity. So obviously with solar, you have very clear generating profiles, and we'll look at those in a minute. But offshore wind is nearly always generating some electricity. And then depending on location, the capacity factor for offshore wind varies between 40 and 50%. And by location, that's just your average wind speed, which obviously plays the largest role in your capacity factor. But again, a very high capacity factor. Wind provides a natural hedge to fluctuating fuel prices. So instead of getting a financial hedge specifically for fuel, building offshore wind gives us that free fuel resource that is very often generating when fuel prices are high. And again, my next couple slides will dive into that a little bit more. But for Dominion Energy's 2,600 megawatt CVOW project, they estimate that the fuel savings will be at least $3 billion in its first 10 years of operation. So significant fuel savings there. Offshore wind is also, wind speeds are highly correlated with winter storm events. And so that's another area that I'll call out is obviously we've thought about this more and more as winter storms kind of become a phenomenon that impacts our electricity generation. And when you've got winter storms and the Carolinas are cold, that is very highly correlated with high Atlantic winds. So again, offshore wind can provide a really solid resource during some of those storm events.
Madam Chair,
Commissioner Caston?
if you know the answer to this, if you don't
Sure.
answer. Thinking about that wind and the storms, is there a wind speed limit?
Yes.
Minimum and
Yep. Yeah, so every turbine has what's called a cut in and a cut out speed. Those differ per turbine. And it's not only do they differ per manufacturer, but turbines can actually be adjusted based on where they're being installed. And so, yes, there is a cutout speed. And so when winds get too high, that turbine knows we need to stop generating. They feather their blades so that they can move out of the direct impact from wind. And there's a number of things that those turbines can do when winds do get too high and they need to shut out. The cutout speeds are very high. I can't remember off the top of my head. But they're quite high. They can generate through some pretty amazing storm events. All right. And then in addition to winter storms, one of the other big benefits of the generation profile of offshore wind is that it is very strong summer afternoons, and winter mornings. So those peak times, offshore wind is a highly reliable resource, and is when offshore wind is generating some of its highest output. So I've got two slides here. These are some of my favorites. This is a winter wind profile, a winter generating profile specific to South Carolina resources. It's kind of the state averaged as a whole. This data comes from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. And what this graphic shows is if you installed the exact same amount, so call it 100 megawatts, if you installed 100 megawatts of land-based wind, offshore wind, and solar, what would that profile look like? And so the blue up top is offshore wind. You can see there that in the winter, the resource offshore wind is a very strong resource, generating between 40 and 50% capacity throughout the day. And again, highest, that blue bar represents the utilities on peak demand between 6 a.m. and 9 a.m. And again, that is when you've got a significant amount of offshore wind resource, so it becomes incredibly valuable to the grid. It's also when you've got solar just starting to ramp up. So as we put more and more low-cost solar onto the grid, it's important to have that diversity of resource that then brings in that additional generating profile. Land-based wind, although that is not a thing in the Carolinas or in South Carolina yet. If kind of looking at the land-based wind profile, again, it's very complementary. Specifically with solar, but also with offshore wind. And so that gray line looks at if you put an equal amount of each of those generating resources on the grid, what would your average output look like? So winter, again, offshore wind is an incredibly solid resource in the winter with a high capacity factor. Summer winds tend to be very strong in the afternoon. Again, the capacity factor during the summer is lower than in the winter. However, it is, again, a very reliable resource in that 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. window when everybody's cranking their air conditioning. I hadn't really noticed this until I started looking at offshore wind generation profiles, but when you go to the beach, it gets windy in the afternoon. And so here that is illustrated with these kind of evening winds coming in off the Atlantic, and so providing electricity again when it is most needed. So just to summarize quickly, we talked a bit about the economic development opportunities that offshore wind brings to South Carolina, including the manufacturing supply chain, skilled jobs, how offshore wind meets energy demand. I always think about the winter storm events, summer afternoons, winter mornings, and then how offshore wind can contribute to a diverse and reliable grid. And that wraps up our slides, but excited to answer more questions from you all.
Thank you, Ms. Collins and Ms. Lohan. Commissioners, questions? Commissioner Carly Williams?
Thank you, Chair Belzer. And thank you all for being here. It's great to be able to sit here and bring new knowledge to us. When you were talking with Vice Chair Powers, one of the statements that you made is that there are no offshore wind projects underway off South Carolina's coast. Can you talk a little bit about South Carolina and the BOEM process that was stopped? And also, you may know, and I guess the relationship of what is happening off the coast of North Carolina that is right on the edge of the extension of the South Carolina boundary, if that is within your wheelhouse of knowledge and related to something that you spoke about today. If it's not.
And if it's not going to bring in any other documents that are not part of this presentation, please.
Understood.
I know those are limits, but it's just.
Yes.
Sometimes our role is just to ask the questions, and if there's not an answer today, that's fine. We'll hear it from somebody else.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah. Well, then let's speak to the two projects in the Carolina Long Bay. There are two projects that are underway. Those are 24 miles off the coast. 22, thank you. At their nearest point, which is Bald Head Island. You know, those 25, thank you. There are so many of these distance metrics per project that they're very easy. I'd just say 20.
And I don't mean to put you on the spot for those numbers, because we did have a presentation on one of those projects. So I think just generally explaining how, as it's my understanding, they're in the North Carolina waters, but they are off to a tourist mind. They are off the coast of South Carolina, but legally I think they're considered in North Carolina.
Yeah, so they're actually in federal waters, which is interesting because sometimes in the early processes they were kind of ascribed to specific states, but federal waters is federal jurisdiction, and you might say, oh, it's closest to this state or that state. I think in some ways that's been a little bit misleading. You know, the Carolina Long Bay projects are very much could be South Carolina projects, could be North Carolina, or could be part of either. From the tourist perspective, I do think that's a very important question for us to address, and Carly talked about that a little bit. If you want to dive into that, please go ahead further, but there's a lot of good information out there on tourism impacts.
Yeah, I'm. So just for a little context, I received my master's degree from UNCW in coastal policy. So I worked a lot with specifically kind of the grassroots and the fisheries communities there, and I was kind of the first boots on the ground to engage with those communities and gauge their interest and their information needs. In terms of the South Carolina question, those South Carolina projects were removed from consideration for development because of intersection with North Atlantic right whale critical calving habitat. Okay. So again, the Bureau of Ocean Management process, really what they do is they look for commercial interests and they try to narrow down where there's conflict, and they avoid conflict where they can, and then where there's conflict that cannot be avoided, then there are guidelines for mitigation. So that was an example of a place where the conflict was avoided to avoid any conflicts with critically endangered species. In terms of the tourism and coastal community impacts, I don't want to say that there's a lot of direct conversations there. I think people really want to know what the impact is to the environment, what the impact is, you know, when they're sitting on their beach chair on the beach. And at 22 or 25 miles from shore, if you have eagle eye vision and maybe some really expensive binoculars, you may be able to see projects or the tips of turbines on a very clear winter day. But it's not something that is going to necessarily alter the view shed of the average beachgoer in southern North Carolina or northern South Carolina. There's also a lot of work that is done on the federal level, the state level, and within project specifics to engage with the fisheries communities. And the feedback that we've gotten from communities that I've engaged with is that they're really happy with how things are going, that they're in the loop, they're involved, their knowledge is utilized to kind of guide that process. And there's so many great examples of how developers kind of uniquely meet the needs of communities. So there's kind of no one size fits all answer, but I think that the Carolinas are known for sea turtle migration, whale migration, the charter fisheries industry. Those are all very prevalent conversations that are happening up and down the coast. So in terms to, you know, kind of the average person who goes to Bald Head Island or Myrtle Beach, they probably wouldn't know that an offshore wind project was off the coast. But those conversations are happening with the key stakeholders around the key environmental issues or the key management issues for individual towns. And again, I think that the overarching answer is it's not a one size fits all community, but that's kind of where we come in. And being located on the coast, I'm able to build relationships with those communities and make introductions to make sure the right people are talking to each other, and all of the concerns are, brought up early and often.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
On page 11, and you may have covered this, my question is, are there businesses in South Carolina that are already supplying pieces and parts for offshore wind projects? And did this list include engineering design components, or is it all about the hard physical construction?
So the American Jobs Project that is referenced here, and there's a link included in the presentation. They list a little bit of everything from the manufacturing, and again, Prismium Group is an example of they are manufacturing. They have contracts, I should say, to manufacture the cables for a project. I'm not sure which specific one.
So the dollar amount is what they currently have or have under contract for construction.
Yeah,
okay.
And then the American Jobs Project is a good reference point, but our website, again, we maintain a supply chain database of the current land-based wind suppliers as well.
Yeah, and I'll mention Nexians is based in Goose Creek. They specifically chose that location because of access to the water, and they are the first U.S. subsea cable manufacturer. And so they have a contract with the they've got a contract with, I think Prismian's got a contract with CVO, but anyhow, they are selling to, they've got U.S. projects that they are selling to, and they're very, very proud South Carolina, a very proud South Carolina manufacturing facility, and always excited to talk about their work.
But I think that's the other important component to remember as well, is the investment in the supply chain that happens in South Carolina is not limited to serving projects in the Carolinas. Those large components are manufactured on the water, and once they're on the water, they can go anywhere up and down the coast that they need to, and they can supply projects for years to come. It's not a short-term investment. And same thing with these smaller manufacturing JV or supplier components that are made throughout the state. They're not just limited to, projects adjacent to our coast. They can go anywhere in the country that they need to support the industry.
And does this analysis look at design, or is it just supply chain from a physical perspective?
Because you had mentioned the engineering aspect, I want to say that the South Carolina Jobs Report does include some of the planning and engineering opportunities as well, but we can double check that report and verify. But that is something that will be captured in the South Carolina supply chain study as well.
Thank you very much. Thanks
Absolutely.
again for being here.
Thank you.
Commissioners? Mr. Adams, do you have anything further?
No, ma'am.
Mr. Huber?
No, Madam Chair, thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Collins, Ms. Lohan, and Mr. Adams, I'd like to thank you all for being here today. Certainly very informative, timely information, and we certainly appreciate you sharing your expertise with us here today. Mr. Adams, Mr. Huber, I would like for you to check with our staff council just to make sure that if there's anything that needs to be located, that it can be done within the requisite time frames.
Yes, ma'am.
So thank you. And with that, we will close this proceeding. And again, thank you very much for being with us today. This allowable ex parte briefing is adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.